The day it all shattered was a Tuesday, I remember, because the office was always quietest on a Tuesday. The big meetings were over, and everyone was just grinding through the week. He called me into his office, our office, and I thought it was to discuss the quarterly projections. I had the file right there in my hand, but he wasn't alone. His lawyer was there, a man in a suit so crisp it looked like it could cut paper, and my own business partner, the man I'd built everything with for 15 years. Couldn't even look me in the eye. The words he used were so clinical: restructuring, consolidation, a necessary pivot. But what it meant was simple. I was being excised, pushed out. The company we'd built from a 2-person operation in a garage. The company that was my life's work was now his alone. He offered me a settlement. It was an insult, a fraction of what my shares were worth, a pittance compared to the sweat equity I'd poured into every brick of that place, and the debt had structured things so cleverly. A lot of the initial expansion loans were in my name, personally guaranteed. He walked away with their asset. I was left holding the liability, a mountain of debt, and a shattered self-image. I wasn't a co-founder anymore. I was a creditor, a problem to be managed. The laughter didn't start right away. It was a slow creeping thing. First it was the whispers and the industry newsletters. Visionary founder parts ways with firm. They made it sound like my choice, but everyone in our circle knew. The phone calls stopped, the lunch invitations dried up. Then came the condescending remarks at the one industry event I forced myself to attend. David from the venture capital firm that backed us early on patted me on the shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Claire, there's always a place for someone with your enthusiasm. Maybe a smaller pond." He said it with a smile, but his eyes were pitying. Another former colleague, Sarah, who I'd hired myself, told me she was surprised I'd lasted as long as I did. She said the market had just gotten too sophisticated for my old school approach. I stood there, nodding, smiling, while inside I was collapsing. The initial paralysis was the worst part. It wasn't just sadness or anger, it was a complete system shutdown. I'd wake up, and for a few seconds everything was normal. Then the memory would hit like a physical blow. The debt numbers would scroll behind my eyes. $500,000 more. I'd lie in bed for hours staring at the ceiling, my mind a frantic trapped animal looking for an exit that didn't exist. I had no resources. The settlement money would be gone in a year, just covering the minimum payments on the debt. I had no plan. Every idea I started to form just crumbled under the weight of the reality, and I had no support system because our entire social world was the business. Our friends were his friends. They chose a side, and it wasn't mine. The first phase, the foundation of survival, had to be brutal and honest. I couldn't think about buying a company. I had to think about getting through the next. Our emotional triage came first. I found a therapist. I remember sitting in her office, a room that was too beige and too quiet, and just wordlessly crying for 20 minutes. She didn't try to fix it, she just let the silence sit there, and slowly I started to talk about the betrayal, the humiliation, the rage. She called it a form of grief. I was grieving the death of my professional life, my identity. Her first practical advice was to cut ties completely. I had to block his number. I unfollowed everyone connected to the company on social media. I stopped reading the industry news. It was like withdrawing from a drug. The withdrawal was painful but necessary. I had to rediscover who I was without the title of CEO next to my name. The financial triage was just as grim. I sat down at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet and listed every single debt, every loan, every credit card I added. It all up. The number was even worse than ID feared. I created a bare-bones budget that shocked me. I canceled every subscription, every non-essential. I sold my car. I moved out of my apartment and rented a small furnished studio. It had a window that looked out onto a brick wall. That wall became my metaphor. It was solid. It was right in front of me. I couldn't see past it, but I could focus on the brick right in front of my face. I took any source of income I could find. I did freelance consulting for small businesses that couldn't afford my old rates. I took a part-time job doing bookkeeping for a local bakery. It was tedious work, but it was simple. It had a beginning and an end. There was no betrayal in balancing a ledger. The first small one felt so insignificant, but it changed everything. I'd been trying to land a proper consulting client for weeks. I'd pitched a small family-owned manufacturing company on streamlining their supply chain. The owner was skeptical, had heard about my fall from grace, but I'd done my homework. I'd spent a week researching his business, his competitors, his specific pain points. I went in with a plan so detailed it was embarrassing. He hired me on the spot. The fee was a fraction of what I used to bill for an hour, but when the transfer hit my bank account, it wasn't about the money. It was a signal, a tiny flickering signal in the dark. It meant I still knew something. I could still create value. That confidence, that tiny spark, was more valuable than any paycheck. It was the first brick I laid for myself. Phase 2 was the calculated ascent. The paralysis was gone, replaced by a cold, focused determination. The anger was still there, but I'd learned to channel it. It became my fuel. I started to think about him, about his company, not with sadness, but with a strategist. I knew that company intimately. I knew its weaknesses because I'd been the one always arguing to fix them. He was a brilliant salesman, but a terrible operator. He chased flashy new clients, but neglected the core business that provided steady revenue. The infrastructure was aging. Employee morale, from what I could gather from whispers, was low. He was vulnerable. The opportunity wasn't to compete with him, it was to acquire him, to take the very thing he used to break me and make it mine. The skill acquisition was a deliberate, almost monastic process. I was strong on vision and client relations, but I knew my financial acumen needed to be razor sharp. For this I spent nights and weekends studying. I didn't just read books on corporate finance and leveraged buyouts. I devoured them. I practiced building financial models until I could do them in my sleep. I learned about negotiation tactics, not from a place of desire, but from a place of necessity. It was like training for a fight. Every skill was another piece of armor. I also knew I had to understand the market better than he did. I subscribed to every trade journal, every market analysis report. I became an expert on the industry landscape, spotting trends. He was too busy to see. Building a network was the most delicate part. I couldn't just call up my old contacts. That would raise alarms. Instead, I started from the edges. I reconnected with former junior employees who had left the company, people who felt disillusioned. I'd meet them for coffee, and we'd just talk shop. I'd ask them about their new roles, what they were seeing in the market. Slowly, carefully, I'd steer the conversation. I never badmouthed him. I'd just ask thoughtful questions. I've been hearing some chatter about delays in the logistics department. Is that still an issue? I was gathering intelligence. I also built A new network entirely outside of our old circle. I connected with lawyers who specialized in distressed assets, with accountants who knew how to structure complex deals. I was assembling a quiet army, and none of them knew the full extent of the battle plan. They just knew I was a knowledgeable, determined consultant looking for opportunities. Phase 3, the final gambit, began with a single phone call, not to him, to the bank that held the company's largest line of credit. I'd learned through my network that the company was struggling to meet its covenants. Their cash flow was tight. My years of financial study had given me the language to speak with the bank's restructuring officer, not as a spurned wife, but as a potential solution. I presented myself as the head of a new investment group, which was in truth just me, and a very brave lawyer who believed in the plan. We made an offer to buy the company's debt. It was a bold, aggressive move. It was the first shot across the bow. The moment of action was a conference call. His lawyer, my lawyer, the bankers, and him. I listened silently as the lead banker explained the offer. I could hear the shock in his voice when he realized it was me behind the big Claire. "What is this?" he stammered. There was no anger yet, just pure, unadulterated confusion. I didn't respond. I let my lawyer speak. We were offering a lifeline, but it was a lifeline with strings attached, strings that would put me in control. The negotiation table was a long, polished piece of wood in a skyscraper downtown. He was there with his team. I was there with mine. He looked older, tired. The swagger was gone. He tried to appeal to me personally. "Claire, we built this together. Be reasonable." I looked at him, and for the first time I felt nothing, no rage, no pain. Just the calm focus of a business person closing a deal. I told him this wasn't personal, it was business. I pointed to the numbers. In the prospectus, I outlined the company's failures under his leadership. I spoke about employee turnover, about missed opportunities, about the decaying infrastructure. I wasn't his ex-wife anymore. I was a creditor who had done her due diligence and found the current management lacking. The negotiation was brutal. He fought, he blustered, but he had no leverage. The debt was real. The numbers were against him. The closing scene was in a different room, a smaller one. It was just the lawyers and the notary. He signed the papers that gave me controlling interest. He did it without looking at me. His signature was an angry scratch on the page. Then he stood up, pushed his chair back, and walked out without a word. The silence he left behind was absolute. The lawyers shuffled papers, the notary stamped documents. But the absence of sound was profound. The people who had laughed, who had pitied me, they weren't in the room, but their silence was. It was finally over. I signed my name last, a clean, clear signature, Claire Allison, CEO. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt quiet. The journey from that shattered Tuesday to this quiet room had been long and hard. It had required every ounce of emotional strength, every financial calculation, every strategic gamble I had in me. I had rebuilt myself brick by brick, and in doing so I had built something stronger than the company I now owned. I had built a person who could not be broken. The new beginning wasn't about owning a building or a brand. It was about owning myself completely and without apology. The blueprint wasn't just for a company, it was for a life. The laughter was the worst part. It wasn't the kind of laughter that fills a room with joy. It was a sharp, brittle sound meant to cut. I remember standing there in the middle of our own living room during a holiday party, holding a tray of canapes. I'd spent 2 days preparing them. My hands still smelled of pastry and herbs. He was holding court by the fireplace, surrounded by his colleagues. His investors, the people who mattered, and he was telling a story about me. It was about the time ID tried to suggest a new marketing strategy for his precious company. ID stayed up for nights researching, putting together a presentation. I thought I was being a partner. He smiled at me indulgently, patted my hand, and told the room how adorable it was that I tried. She's so passionate about her little projects, he said, and the circle of suits chuckled, not a mean chuckle, but something far worse. It was a patronizing, dismissive sound that stripped me of any intelligence, any value, reducing me to a charming pet. My face burned. I felt the weight of every gaze, every suppressed smile. I was the evening's entertainment, the devoted wife, so hopelessly out of her depth. That was the public face of it, but the real poison was administered in private. In the car on the way home, the music was low, the city lights streaking past the window. He turned to me, his voice soft, almost pitying. "You know, darling," he said, "you have a wonderful heart, a truly kind spirit. But business, it's a different world. You'll never really amount to anything in it, not without me to guide you." He said it like he was doing me a favor, like he was protecting me from my own ambitions. "You'll never amount to anything without him." That sentence didn't just hang in the air, it burrowed into my bones. It became a cold, hard fact in the architecture of my life. For a while I believed it. I accepted my role, the supportive shadow, the grateful beneficiary of his success. But the humiliation has a half-life. It decays into something else, something hotter and more durable. Lying awake next to him, listening to his steady, untroubled breath, I replayed those moments, the laughter, the condescension, the absolute certainty in his voice that I was an accessory, not an agent. And one night the shift happened. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a quiet, glacial settling. The tears dried up. The ache of shame solidified into a core of ice. I realized I had been playing a game designed for me to lose. The role of the victim was a trap. So I decided to stop being the victim. I decided to start playing a different game entirely, a more ruthless one. The first step was the most physical. I had to shed my skin. The woman he married was soft. She wore flowing dresses and muted colors. She smiled easily. Her hair was long and often tied back in a simple, unassuming way. I looked in the mirror, and I didn't see an adversary. I saw a victim. So I cut my hair short, severe. I replaced my wardrobe with sharp, tailored suits in black and navy, the colors of authority, the colors of absence. I stopped wearing the delicate jewelry had bought me. I started wearing a single heavy silver cuff, an armament. It was more than appearance. It was a recalibration of my entire being. I practiced a new way of moving through the world, slower, more deliberate. I trained myself not to react but to observe. I learned to sit in silence during conversations, to let the emptiness stretch until the other person felt compelled to fill it, often revealing more than they intended. I cultivated a calm, almost detached demeanor. Where I was once warm, I became cool. Where I was open, I became opaque. I stopped seeing people as friends or enemies. I started seeing them as assets or liabilities. Every interaction, no matter how small, was analyzed for its strategic potential. Emotion was a luxury I could no longer afford. It was a variable that clouded judgment. The long game required a clear head, and the most powerful tool in my new arsenal was their own perception of me to his world. I was just the ex-wife the woman had gracefully let go with a generous settlement. Of course they saw me As harmless, a little bitter perhaps, but ultimately weak, a discarded woman. They would smile at me at charity events, their eyes full of pity. They'd ask how I was holding up. I leaned into it. I perfected the art of playing small. I'd talk about my quiet life, my new interest in gardening, my book club. I'd laugh lightly and say I was just trying to find myself. It was the performance of a lifetime. While they saw a woman tending to her roses, I was studying their company's quarterly reports. While they thought I was discussing novels, I was cultivating sources. Their arrogance was a fortress, and they'd left the main gate wide open, convinced no one would be foolish enough to attack. They underestimated the quiet woman with the shears snipping away at the dead branches. They never considered that she might be learning how to cut down the whole tree. The infiltration began slowly. It had to. I used my status as the harmless ex to my advantage. I'd drop by the office under the pretext of needing to sign some old paperwork. I'd make pleasant small talk with the receptionist who had been there for years. She'd seen everything, and she liked me. I'd really listen to her complaints about the new management, the stressful deadlines, the rumors circulating about the upcoming product launch. I'd have lunch with the wives of his board members. They were fonts of information, complaining about their husbands working late, worrying about a big merger, gossiping about which executive was on the rise and which was falling out of favor. I pieced it all together. Like a mosaic, I learned about their over-reliance on a single aging product line. I learned about their complacency, their belief that their market dominance was unassailable. I learned about the key Project Horizon that was supposed to be their salvation, but was behind schedule and over budget then. The sabotage, it was never direct. It was 1,000 tiny cuts. I couldn't walk in and disrupt things myself. Instead, I became a ghost in the machine, an anonymous tip to a journalist about labor practices in a key factory, triggering an investigation that delayed a shipment. A suggestion whispered to the wife of a junior executive that her husband's brilliant ideas were being stolen by his superior, creating internal friction and mistrust. I used a shell company to buy a small, nearly bankrupt tech firm that held a patent crucial to the Horizon project. Then I quietly tripled the licensing fees, strangling their profit margins. I'd sit in my study watching the business news. I'd see the slow, steady decline in their stock price, a point here, half a point there. The analysts started using words like stagnant and lack of innovation. I watched as their arrogance turned to confusion, then to desperation. They were bleeding, and they didn't even know who was holding the knife. They blamed the market, they blamed incompetent middle management, they blamed each other. The thought that it was me, the discarded wife, never once crossed their minds. That was my masterpiece. The day of the acquisition was not a day of celebration, it was a day of reckoning. My investment group, which I controlled entirely, had been quietly buying up their debt as their value plummeted when we made the offer. It was a lowball, hostile takeover. They had no choice but to accept. They were bankrupt in all but name. The meeting was in their boardroom, the same room where I'd once served coffee. I walked in alone. The air was thick with defeat and shock. He was there at the head of the table. He looked older. The confidence was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out exhaustion. He stared at me as if I were a ghost. I didn't sit. I stood at the opposite end of the table and placed my briefcase down. The room was silent. I looked at each of their faces, the men who had laughed, who had patronized me, who had built their empire on the assumption that people like me didn't matter. I didn't raise my voice I spoke with a chilling calm, each word measured and precise. Gentlemen, I began, this isn't a business transaction. This is a lesson. The cost of your collective arrogance is the loss of everything you built. You believed that strength was about loud voices and bold moves. You confused kindness for weakness and silence for submission. You built your company on the backs of people you considered beneath you. You underestimated the quiet woman in the corner. You thought my value was tied to a man. You were wrong. Your downfall wasn't a market correction, it was 1,000 small corrections I made to the narrative you wrote for me. This company is now mine, not because I want it, but because you no longer deserve it. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumphant thrill. As I rode the elevator down, I felt nothing, a vast echoing emptiness. The revenge I had fantasized about 4 years was complete, and it tasted like dust. The fire that had fueled me for so long had burned down to cold ash. I had won. I had proven him wrong. I had amounted to something far greater than he ever could have imagined, and all by myself. But the victory was hollow. I had sacrificed my softness, my capacity for trust, my ability to connect with anyone on a level that wasn't transactional. I had become the villain in their story, and in doing so I had written myself into a lonely fortified castle of my own. Making the power, however, was real. The freedom was absolute. I am no longer defined by anyone's perception but my own. I answer to no one. The hollowness is the price I pay, and I pay it without complaint. I look at myself in the mirror now, and the woman looking back is sharp, formidable, and utterly untouchable. She is not happy, but she is powerful, and in the end, after being powerless for so long, I have decided that power is the more valuable currency. The world believes I am a monster who destroyed a man out of spite. Let them. I prefer their fear to their pity. The humiliation that sparked my vengeance is now a museum piece in the city I rule, a reminder of the cost of underestimation, and I am its curator. You know how they say in the end it's just business. I used to think that was something cold-hearted people said to justify their actions. I don't think that anymore. It all started after the papers were signed. The divorce was final on paper. I was left with what he, David, and his army of lawyers turned a fair and equitable settlement. In reality, it was the house, which was mortgaged to the hills, had paid for with his business expenses, and a modest alimony that felt more like a monthly reminder of my dependence than a source of income. He kept the company Ethelred Holdings and its substantial assets. He walked away free and clear, or so he thought. I was supposed to fade away. The quiet ex-wife, a footnote in the story of his glorious success. The discovery wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday. I was in the home office, what used to be our office, packing the last of my things into cardboard boxes. The room was a tomb of a shared life that had never really been shared. Most of the files were his, dense with financial jargon I'd never bothered to understand. I was just shoving them into a box to be shredded when a manila folder tucked behind a row of leather-bound ledgers slipped and hit the floor. It wasn't labeled inside. It wasn't a company document. It was a bank statement, but not from our joint account or the business account I knew about. The account holder was something called Orion Trust. The sums moving through it were significant, and the address for the statements was a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands. At first I thought it was a mistake, a client's document misfiled, but then I saw the authorized signatory. It was a scanned signature. But I'd know that arrogant flourish anywhere. It was David's a cold clarity washed over me, the kind you get when a fog you didn't even know was there suddenly lifts. This was the nothing he had left me with. This was the first thread, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me that if I pulled it, the entire tapestry of his life would begin to unravel. I became a ghost in my own life while I played the part of the grieving, financially strained divorcee in public. I was a financial sleuth in private. I spent nights hunched over my laptop, the blue light my only companion. I learned about shell companies, about offshore trusts, about how money can be moved hidden and washed clean through a series of transactions so complex they're designed to be impenetrable. I found more clues: an overlooked credit card bill with charges for flights to Grand Cayman, a scribbled note on an old calendar, just the letters OT, and a number. I was learning a new language, the language of deception, and I was proving to be a surprisingly quick study. But a lone detective can only get so far. I needed specialists. I found Eleanor Vance first. She was a forensic accountant known in certain circles as the Bloodhound. Her website was sparse. Her reviews were from anonymous corporate entities, and her consultation fee was astronomical. I sold a piece of jewelry my mother had left me to pay for the first meeting. I laid it all out for her in her sterile minimalist office, the Orion Trust statement, my notes, my suspicions. She listened, her face a mask of professional detachment. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "Most people who come to me with a story like this are conspiracy theorists. You have a paper trail, a thin one, but it's there." He got sloppy. She took the case not out of sympathy, but because she saw the intellectual puzzle. She saw the challenge. Eleanor led me to Marcus Thorne. If Eleanor was the Bloodhound, Marcus was the Wolf, a lawyer who specialized in the bloody intersection of high-stakes divorce and corporate law. He was expensive, ruthless, and he had a personal vendetta against David's lead counsel. When I explained what we had, a rare smile touched his lips. He hid assets during a divorce proceeding, Marcus said, his voice like gravel. "That's not just dirty pool, that's perjury, that's contempt. That gives us a crowbar to pry open every single financial decision has made for the last 10 years. The legal chess game began. We didn't announce our move with a declaration of war. We filed a quiet, precise motion with the court alleging fraud upon the court and presenting the Orion Trust statement as Exhibit A. The effect was instantaneous. David's panic was palpable. His lawyers, who had been so condescending during the divorce, were now frantically filing motions to suppress, to delay, to obfuscate. But the judge was not amused. The discovery process was reopened wide open. Eleanor, armed with the power of the court, went to work. She subpoenaed records from banks, from investment firms, from Ethelred's own books. She followed the money from Orion Trust through a decade of holding companies, all leading back to Ethelred. David had just hidden money from me, had been systematically siphoning profits from his own company, undervaluing it for a future sale, and stashing the difference offshore. He was defrauding his own shareholders. And we had the evidence. The settlement negotiation was a different preacher this time. Marcus didn't ask for a revised alimony. He went for the jugular. He argued that the entire initial settlement was void, predicated on a fraud. He presented a new number, a sum that represented not just a fair half but a punitive damages amount based on the hidden assets and the legal costs of uncovering them. The threat was clear: settle for this or we take this evidence of corporate fraud to the Securities and Exchange Commission. David's empire was a house of cards, and we were holding a lit match. He settled the wire transfer that hit my account was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It wasn't life-changing, it was destiny-changing, but I wasn't done. The satisfaction wasn't in the money, it was in the knowledge. I now understood David's business, its weaknesses, its pressure points better than he ever thought I could. I knew that Ethelred Holdings, stripped of its hidden reserves, was over-leveraged and vulnerable. The court case, though settled, had spooked investors. The stock price was beginning to wobble. I used the settlement money as my war chest. Quietly, through a series of discreet brokers, I began buying shares of Ethelred stock. It was a slow, patient accumulation. Eleanor crunched the numbers, identifying the point at which we would become a significant minority shareholder. Marcus handled the regulatory filings, the necessary disclosures. We were a perfectly coordinated machine. Then came the catalyst. Ethelred's next quarterly earnings report was a disaster. The loss of the hidden revenue streams, combined with the market's nervousness, sent the stock into a freefall. The board of directors, many of whom had turned a blind eye to David's creative accounting, were in a panic. This was the moment we made our offer. It wasn't friendly, it was a lowball, all-cash bid to take the company private. The board screamed, David threatened, but they had no choice. Their stock was tanking, and we were the only lifeboat to reject our offer. Was to risk a total collapse, shareholder lawsuits, and regulatory scrutiny that would have landed several of them in jail. They caved. They accepted the offer. The day of the final transfer of power, I walked into the Ethelred headquarters for the first time. The staff looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and fear. David was escorted from the building by security. An hour before I arrived, there was no dramatic confrontation that would have been emotional. And this was no longer personal, it was structural. I walked into the CEO's corner office. It was exactly as I'd imagined it: large, expensively furnished with a panoramic view of the city. His personal effects were gone, boxed up. The room was empty, sterile. I didn't sit in the chair behind the vast mahogany desk with a sense of vengeful triumph. I didn't feel a surge of power, I felt a quiet resolution. I sat down the leather side. Under my weight, I looked out at the skyline, the same view David had looked at for years, believing himself. Thinking, I thought about the misplaced document, the late nights of research, the careful strategies of Eleanor and Marcus. It had been a long, complex puzzle, a problem of finance and law and human weakness. And now the final piece had been placed. The problem was solved. The secret ledger had been opened, its true totals revealed, and the balance had been settled, not with emotion, but with exquisite mathematical precision. It was, after all, just business. It started with a coffee stain, a dark, ugly blotch on the quarterly report my ex-husband's company had sent. I was staring at it, not really reading the numbers, just feeling the weight of another legal bill, another denial of the support I was owed. The coffee stain looked like a continent on some alien map, and I thought, this is my life now. Coffee stain on someone else's financial document. But then my phone buzzed. It was Sarah from the old days. She'd been let go from the marketing department a year before the divorce was final. We met for lunch. She looked tired. She told me about her severance package, or lack of it, how they'd called it a voluntary resignation when it was anything But the same legal tricks, the same slippery language. I was fighting against. A little bell went off in my head. It wasn't just a ring, it was a clang. I started digging. I went online on those professional forums people pretend their bosses don't read. I found a thread about the company. It was a graveyard of grievances. A programmer named Leo wrote about how they'd outsourced his entire team after he'd trained the replacement, so warehouse manager David detailed how safety regulations were consistently ignored until someone got hurt, and then it was the workers' fault. There was a supplier, Anya, small business owner, whose contract was abruptly cancelled, nearly bankrupting her. Story after story, a pattern, a blueprint of broken promises. It hit me one night sitting at my kitchen table with all these printouts spread around me. This wasn't just about me getting a fair settlement. This was a system, a machine designed to chew people up and spit them out. And my ex-husband wasn't just the operator, he was a cog in it too, maybe the biggest cog. But still just a part of the machine. The real enemy was the machine itself, the company, the entity. And then the idea came. It was so absurd I almost laughed out loud. What if we didn't just complain about the machine? What if we didn't just try to get a better deal from the machine? What if we bought the machine? What if the people who were cheated, who were laid off, who were scorned, what if we became the owners? The first meeting was in the back room of a library, just me, Sarah, and Leo, the programmer. We were nervous. It felt like a conspiracy. Leo kept looking over his shoulder. Sarah spoke in a hushed voice. We shared our stories, and with each one the absurd idea started to feel a little less absurd. It started to feel necessary. Leo said his piece about the code had written that was now making millions for people who had fired him. Without a second thought he finished and looked at the table. The silence was thick. Then I said it. I said the crazy idea out loud. What if we bought it? The next meeting was in my basement. We had more people. David, the warehouse manager, came. Anya, the supplier, came. There were a few others, faces pale in the glow of the single bare bulb ID hung. We were a collection of wounds and grievances. But that night something shifted. We stopped being just victims. We started taking inventory. Leo had the technical knowledge. Sarah understood the brand, the public face. David knew the logistics, the physical bones of the operation. Anya understood the supply chain intimately. I knew the financials. I'd spent 2 years poring over them with my lawyer. I knew where the money was hidden, where the bodies were buried. We weren't just a support group anymore. We were a shadow board of directors. We started meeting every week. We pooled our money. It wasn't much, a few $100s from each of us. It was all we could spare, but it was a start. We called it the Reclamation Fund. It sounded grand for what it was, a few $1,000s in a shared bank account, but the name gave U.S. purpose. We were there to reclaim what was taken from us, not just money, but dignity, a sense of justice. We had to go public. We couldn't just make a quiet bid. The company would squash us. We had to turn this into a story, a moral crusade. Sarah was brilliant at this. She drafted a press release. We didn't call ourselves a group of disgruntled ex-employees. We called ourselves the community stakeholders, because that's what we were, the community the company had built its wealth on, and then discarded the day we launched the website and sent the press releases. Was terrifying. We held our breath for a day. Nothing. Then a local business journalist picked it up, then a national blog, then it was on the news. The story had legs. It was a perfect narrative. The little guys versus the corporate giant. The people who built the company versus the people who currently owned it. We gave interviews. We told our stories not with anger, But with a quiet, firm conviction, we talked about the value we had created. We talked about the fairer way we wanted to run things. The public sympathy was overwhelming. People started writing to us offering support. Some offered small donations to our fund. Others offered their skills. A retired CFO helped us structure our bid. The pressure on the company's board was immense. Their stock price started to dip. Bad press has a way of doing that. They put out statements calling us a fringe group and serious, but we were serious. We had a formal offer. It wasn't the highest offer they would get. We knew that, but it was a legitimate one. Our financial structure was Leo's masterpiece. He proposed a worker and community cooperative model. The buyout would be financed partly by our pooled funds, but mostly by a loan that would be paid back through future profits. The key was that every employee would become a part owner. There would be no more us and them. The people doing the work would own the work. We presented it not just as a purchase, but as a transformation. We were offering the board a way out, a chance to be remembered not as the people who bled a company dry, but as the people who enabled a new ethical model of business to emerge. The negotiation was brutal. They tried every trick. They belittled us. They threatened us with lawsuits. They tried to scare us off, but we held firm. Because we weren't one person, we were a community. When one of us felt weak, the others were strong. When I got scared, David would talk about the courage of his workers facing down unsafe conditions. When Leo got bogged down in the legal details, Anya would remind us why we were doing this for her employees who lost their jobs when the contract was canceled the day the board accepted our offer. I can't even describe the feeling. We were all in the basement, huddled around a speakerphone. When the lawyer said the words, "The board has voted to accept your proposal," there was a silence. Then it wasn't a cheer, it was a release, a deep collective sigh. Sarah started crying. Leo pumped his fist in the air, a quiet, fierce gesture. David just smiled, a real deep smile I'd never seen on him before. We had done it. We had actually bought the company. The celebration was ours. It wasn't in a fancy hotel. It was in a park. We had a picnic. Families where their kids were running around. Anya brought food from her catering business. It was simple. It was real. We were no longer a coalition of the wronged. We were a community of owners. The first board meeting was the next week. We held it in the actual boardroom. It felt strange sitting in those leather chairs around that giant mahogany table, the same table where decisions had been made to lay off Sarah, to outsource Leo's team, but the energy was completely different. The first item on the agenda wasn't profit margins, it was a proposal for a new employee ownership plan. The second was a review of safety protocols in the warehouse. The third was a discussion about reinstating relationships with small local suppliers like Anya's company. We didn't know everything. We made mistakes. It was messy, but every decision was made with a different question in mind. Not how does this maximize shareholder value, but how does this honor the people who make this company work. We instituted a living wage, not just a minimum wage. We created transparent promotion pathways. We gave people a real voice. I saw my ex-husband once. About a year later, he was across the street. He saw me, and for a second our eyes met. He looked away quickly. There was no anger left in me, just a kind of pity. He had spent his life building a fortress of wealth and power, and he was alone inside it. I was part of something. I was a part of a community. I had a purpose that was bigger than my own bank account. The message of our story isn't about revenge, it's about reclamation. It's about the simple powerful idea that an institution, a company, a community, it doesn't belong to the person with the most money. It belongs to the people who give it life, who pour their energy into it, who care about its future. True power isn't about individual control, it's about collective purpose. We weren't a group of CEOs. We were a group of people who had been broken by the same system and who decided to pick up the pieces and build something new, something better together. And we did it. It wasn't just me, it was us. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of my life stopping after he left, after the lawyers were done, after the last box was packed. There was just this void. I'd sit in the middle of the living room floor in an apartment that didn't feel like mine and just stare at the wall. The paint was a different color, a neutral rental property. Beige. It felt like a metaphor for my entire existence. I'd been painted over, erased. My identity had been so wrapped up in being his wife, in being part of that power couple, and living in that big house with the perfect landscaping. It was a gilded cage, but I hadn't seen the bars until the door swung shut behind him. Now, stripped of all that, I didn't know who I was. I was a ghost in my own life. I'd look in the mirror and see a stranger. The eyes were hollow. There was no one home behind them. I felt like I'd been dismantled piece by piece, and there was nothing left of the original structure. Just a pile of rubble. That's what rock bottom felt like. Not a dramatic crash, but a slow, quiet settling into dust. The moment of choice wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration. It was more pathetic than that. I was standing in the grocery store, staring at a wall of cereal boxes. I couldn't decide. I just stood there, frozen. For maybe 20 minutes, people were pushing their carts around me. The sheer inability to choose a breakfast food, it was so trivial, but it broke something in me. It was the final proof that I was completely lost, and a voice, a tiny, stubborn whisper in the back of my mind, said, "This is it. You either lie down here in the middle of the aisle and let them sweep you up, or you pick a box, any box, and you go home." I picked the most ridiculous sugar-filled cereal I could find, a kind I'd never have allowed in the house before. It was a tiny act of rebellion against the void. That was the start, the decision to begin the painful, messy work of rebuilding from the inside out. Therapy felt like admitting defeat at first, sitting in that quiet room telling a stranger about the crushing weight of nothingness. But it became my anchor. My therapist, Dr. Evans, had this incredibly calm way of reframing things. She didn't talk about fixing my marriage or getting revenge. She talked about rebuilding my foundation. She made me see that my self-worth had been built on sand, his approval, his success, his image of me. When that washed away, there was nothing left to stand on. We had to go down to the bedrock. We started with the simplest, most brutal questions. What do you like? What makes you feel calm? What did you love to do before you met him? I had no answers. I'd forgotten. I started with small things. I bought a sketchbook. I hadn't drawn since college. The first few pages were awful, stiff, hesitant lines. But I kept going. I'd sit in the park and just draw trees, not to create a masterpiece, but to remember the feeling of a pencil in my hand, the sound of it scratching on the paper. It was a meditation. I started reading again, not business books or self-help manuals, but old dog-eared novels I'd loved as a teenager. I rediscovered poetry. I allowed myself to cry at the sad parts. I was learning the language of self-compassion. It felt foreign, like speaking a language I'd known as a child, but forgotten. Instead of Berating myself for feeling sad. ID just acknowledge it. Okay, you're sad today. That's allowed. What would feel comforting right now? It was about setting boundaries with my own inner critic. The one that sounded so much like him. I learned to tell that voice to be quiet. The biggest shift was when I started making pottery. It was something I'd always been curious about. I signed up for a class at a local community center. The first time I put my hands on a lump of wet clay and felt it spin on the wheel, it was like a jolt. It was messy, it was physical, it was completely and utterly mine. I wasn't good at it. My first bowls were lopsided, my vases collapsed, but I was obsessed. The focus it required was absolute. You can't think about your failed marriage or your empty bank account when you're trying to center a spinning ball of mud. Your entire world narrows to the pressure of your hands, the sound of the wheel, the smell of the clay. It was the first time in years I felt truly present, not performing, not worrying, just being. I started spending every spare moment in the little studio I'd carved out in a corner of my apartment. I got better. My hands learned the language of the clay. I developed a style. It was rough, textured, imperfect. It was the opposite of the sleek minimalist aesthetic we'd had in the old house, and I loved it. I started giving pieces to friends. They'd say, "This is beautiful, you should sell these." I laughed it off. It was my therapy, my sanctuary. But the idea stuck. I created a simple website, just a gallery of my favorite pieces. I called it Unglazed, a little play on words because I often left the raw clay exposed. I wasn't thinking about a business, I was thinking about sharing something I loved. Then an odd thing happened. People started buying them, not just friends of friends, but strangers. They'd write me little notes. "This vase feels so grounded. I love the weight of this mug in my hands." It resonated. My little passion project, born from a need to heal my own hands, was touching other people. I had to get a proper kiln. I rented a small studio space, just a room, really, in an old warehouse. It was mine. The smell of clay and glaze filled the air. It was the most authentic space I'd ever occupied. The business grew organically, slowly. I never took out a loan. I reinvested every dollar it made. It was a living thing, and I was just tending to it. It was my purpose, and I'd stumbled into it by accident, by following a thread of joy. I remember the day I found out. I was at a trade show, a small India-focused one. My booth was modest, but there was a steady stream of people. Woman was looking at one of my larger planters, running her hands over the carved surface. She said, "You know, your work is so different from the new line over at Viridian Concepts. Their stuff is so cold and mass-produced. This has a soul." Viridian Concepts, that was his company, my ex-husband's empire. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked her what she meant. She explained that Viridian had recently launched a new home goods division, trying to tap into the artisanal market. They were producing cheap ceramic-looking pieces overseas, but marketing them as handcrafted inspiration. I went online that night and looked it up. There it was, a pale, soulless imitation of what real artists were doing, and it was failing. The reviews were brutal. Feels plastic, no character, assembly line junk. The irony was so thick I could taste it. The division he had tasked one of his Hotshop VPs with launching, the one that was supposed to be the new trendy revenue stream, was floundering, and my little company, Unglazed, this thing I'd built from a place of brokenness, was being cited in articles as the authentic alternative that was eating their lunch. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a deep, quiet sense of validation. It wasn't about him. It was about the fact that the world was responding to something real, something built with integrity, and I had built it. The email came from a corporate address I didn't recognize. It was from a mergers and acquisitions director at Viridian. They wanted to schedule a call. I almost deleted it, but curiosity got the better of me. On the video call, a very polished, very nervous-looking man explained that Viridian was looking to incorporate unique passion-driven brands into their portfolio. They saw great synergy with Unglazed. They wanted to buy me out, make me a very rich woman, absorb my brand into theirs. I listened politely. I asked questions. I let him talk himself in circles. When he was finished, I thanked him for his time and said I'd need to consult with my team. I hung up the call and looked around my small dusty studio. My team was me and the clay and the quiet certainty I'd built inside myself. I did consult with someone, though, my lawyer, a sharp woman who had seen me at my worst. I laid out the situation. She crunched the numbers. Viridian's home goods division was a sinking ship. My company, while small, was profitable, debt-free, and had a fiercely loyal customer base. Its value wasn't just in its revenue, it was in its reputation, its soul, and we knew Viridian needed that soul far more than I needed their money. So we made a counteroffer, a bold, almost laughable one. We proposed that Unglazed acquire the entire home goods division of Viridian Concepts. We had the leverage. My lawyer structured it brilliantly. It wasn't a hostile takeover, it was a strategic absorption. We would take on their assets, their contracts, but we would dismantle their operation and fold the worthwhile pieces into our own ethos. We would fire the VPs and hire real artisans the day the deal was finalized. I sat in my studio. There was no celebration, no popping champagne. I held a cup I'd dethroned last week. It was a little uneven, but the glaze had turned a beautiful deep blue. I ran my thumb over the rim. The real victory wasn't on any paperwork. It wasn't the fact that I now technically owned a piece of my ex-husband's empire. The real win was the feeling of the clay in my hands years ago when I was nothing. It was the slow, patient process of learning to center myself on the wheel. It was the unshakable knowledge that I had built something from a place of truth. The company was just a byproduct. The real acquisition was me. I had found myself, and no one could ever take that away again. It started as a whisper in the dark, a blank screen and a cursor blinking back at me. The only sound was the hum of my laptop fan. I created the account anonymously, no name, no face, just a handle, Phoenix_rising_, a little dramatic. I know, but it felt true. The divorce papers were final. The house was quiet. The life I'd built for 20 years was just gone. And he got the company we'd talked about starting on our living room floor, the one I'd poured my soul into in those early years. He got it all. And I got a settlement that felt like a consolation prize. So I started typing. I didn't have an audience. I didn't want one. It was a digital diary. I wrote about the silence in the house. I wrote about the hollow feeling of opening the fridge and seeing only my food. I wrote about the shame of starting over at 45. I wrote about the little things like trying to remember how to pay a bill online because had always handled that. It was raw, it was messy, there were typos because I was crying while I typed. And then one day a comment appeared. It was from someone named Sarah. It just said, "I feel this. Thank you for writing it." And then another. And another. A small community found me. They were mostly women, but some men too, all navigating their own versions of collapse. We weren't a support group, not really. We were just witnesses to each other's pain. That validation That simple Me Too, it was like a lifeline. It was the first time I didn't feel entirely alone. The post started to change slowly. It wasn't just about the pain anymore, it was about the frustration of feeling obsolete. My skills were from a different era, so I decided to learn. I wrote about signing up for my first online course, a coding boot camp for absolute beginners. I documented the sheer terror of it. The first time I managed to make Hello World appear on the screen, I posted a screenshot. My small community cheered. They became my accountability partners. Then it was a digital marketing course, then one on financial literacy for entrepreneurs. I shared my notes, my failures, my small wins. The blog and the social media channels ID started to go with it, became a real-time documentary of a rebuild. The anonymous persona became a project. People weren't just following a story of recovery, they were investing in a journey of transformation. The audience grew from hundreds to thousands. The messages changed from "I feel your pain" to "What are you learning next? And you can do this." Monetization happened almost by accident. A small company reached out asking if they could place an ad on the blog. The income was tiny, but it was a signal. It meant the story had value. Then came sponsorships for the online courses I was using. I only promoted things I genuinely believed in, and I was transparent about the partnerships. That transparency built more trust. The community felt like they were growing with me. The big shift was the digital product. It was their idea, really. People kept asking for a consolidated guide, a roadmap of the resources I'd used, so I created one, the Rebuild Toolkit. It was just a simple PDF, a curated list of courses, books, and mindset tips. I priced it low. It wasn't about getting rich, it was about providing a ladder for others. It sold thousands of copies in the first week. The community wasn't just supporting me emotionally anymore, they were funding the mission. That's when the idea first flickered to life. It was a crazy thought, a fantasy. What if I could get it back? What if I could take the company he thought I was never a real part of? I remember the post I wrote. It was late. The title was A Crazy Dream. I laid it all out. I told them about the company, our company. I told them how it had been my idea, the name, the first client ID brought, and I wrote about the feeling of seeing it become his trophy, his success story, while I was relegated to the history books. And then I typed the words, "What if we bought it?" The comment section exploded. It was a wave of pure, unfiltered enthusiasm. Yes, let's do it. How can we help? That was the moment I knew it wasn't just my dream anymore. It was ours. We decided on an equity crowdfunding campaign. It was a perfect fit. Instead of looking for one big investor, we'd get thousands of small ones. The very people who had followed the journey would become the owners. We built the campaign page together. I shared drafts, they gave feedback, they helped me craft the video script. When we launched, it felt like unleashing a storm. The community shared it everywhere. It wasn't just my network, it was a global network of people who believed in the story. The press picked it up. The scorned ex-wife crowdfunding a takeover. It was a sensational headline, but the truth underneath was more powerful. It was a story about community. The funding goal was met in 48 hours. It was overwhelming. We kept going, blowing past the initial target. His company was completely blindsided. They issued a statement calling it a publicity stunt, a hostile action driven by emotion, but that just fueled us more. Every dismissive comment from their board was met with a new wave of investment from our side. We weren't hostile, we were a movement. We were proof that a brand isn't just a logo, it's the people who believe in it. The acquisition was successful. It felt surreal walking into the headquarters for the first time as the CEO. The staff was nervous, the media was there, but all I could think about was the people who made it happen. My first official act was not a strategic memo or a restructuring plan, it was a live stream. I stood in the empty boardroom, my phone propped up on the table. I spoke directly to the camera, to my community, my investors, my partners. I thanked them by name where I could. I told them this wasn't my office, it was ours. I explained that this company would now operate on a new model. Complete transparency. We would share our successes and our failures openly. We would poll them on big decisions. Their ideas would be heard. We weren't just building a business, we were building a proof of concept, a proof that a company could be run by its community, powered by a shared purpose rather than just profit. The first year was about integration. We started a weekly newsletter detailing everything happening in the company. We held monthly open forums where any investor could ask a question. We launched product ideas that came directly from the community. The morale inside the company skyrocketed. The old guard was skeptical at first, but they saw the results. The engagement was incredible. Our customer loyalty became the stuff of legends because our customers were also our owners. I saw him once at an industry event. He was across the room. He looked older. He didn't approach me, and I didn't approach him. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet acknowledgement. The person had underestimated the non-essential partner now controlled the narrative. But the victory wasn't about him anymore. It was about the thousands of people who had chosen to believe in a different way of doing things. The comeback wasn't just mine, it was digital, it was communal, and it was only just beginning. The real work, the work of building something truly lasting, was ahead of us. And for the first time I wasn't doing it alone. My grandmother had these hands, they were always cool to the touch, but they were strong. She'd hold my face when I was a girl, and she'd look right into me past the freckles and the childish worries. She'd say, "A man can lose his fortune in a day, darling. A woman must build hers in silence. Over a lifetime, never ever let a man hold your purse strings. Your independence is your only true security." I'd nod, but I was young. I thought her warnings were just the quaint fears of another generation. I didn't understand they were a blueprint for survival. I met James when I was in my 20s. He was all charm and ambition, a whirlwind of big ideas and even bigger promises. He loved my grandmother. Or he said he did. He called her feisty, but I see now it was a patronizing kind of affection. Had listened to her talk about money and wink at me as if to say, "Is she adorable with her old-fashioned notions?" I fell for it. I fell for him. I handed over my financial life bit by bit, trusting that his MBA and his Wall Street bravado knew better than my grandmother's quiet wisdom. I became the perfect corporate wife, the hostess, the silent partner in the background. The divorce was brutal, not angry exactly. It was cold, a clinical dismantling of a partnership he now deemed no longer profitable. He was generous by the standards of the lawyers, a generous settlement, a generous alimony, but it was all on his terms. It was his money, his allowance to me. I felt like a retired employee pensioned off. The arrogance in his eyes wasn't malice, it was pity. He pitied my lack of a real career, my dependence on his success. And in my lowest moments, I pitied myself too. I thought my grandmother's legacy had died with her, that I had failed the one lesson she tried so hard To teach me then a month after the papers were signed a letter of thick cream-colored stationery from a law firm I'd never heard of. I almost threw it away, thinking it was another piece of the endless divorce paperwork, but something made me open it. It was an invitation to meet regarding the estate of Eleanor Marie Vance. My grandmother sitting in that lawyer's office was like stepping into a secret world. The room was all dark wood and leather, smelling of old books and quiet power. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, had my grandmother's same cool, assessing eyes. He told me that upon her death she had established a trust. It had been maturing, managed by his firm, completely separate from my marriage, invisible to James and his army of accountants. The principal was substantial, more than I could have imagined, but it was the conditions that took my breath away. The money was to be released to me under to circumstances, and to only first for the pursuit of an advanced education, not a frivolous degree, but something serious, something that built a foundation, or second, to fund the start of a legitimate business venture. And then Mr. Sterling read the clause verbatim, his voice perfectly even. Under no circumstances, he said, may these funds be used to settle debts incurred by a spouse or partner, or to provide liquidity for a failing enterprise controlled by a man. It was her voice. It was my grandmother speaking from beyond the grave, throwing me a lifeline I had even known I needed. She hadn't trusted my judgment with James, so she had built a backstop. She had given me a second chance. I didn't touch the money for a year. I lived on the alimony, on Jan's condescending allowance. I let everyone think I was defeated adrift. James would hear snippets about me through mutual friends that I was taking some time figuring things out. He probably imagined me in a yoga class or shopping therapy. He never once imagined I was in a war room of my own making. I enrolled at the London School of Economics. I used the trust to pay for a master's in finance. It was the most deliberate, strategic decision of my life. I wasn't there to find myself. I was there to arm myself while James was playing high-stakes games with his company, leveraging buyouts and expanding aggressively. I was in a library learning the precise mechanics of how those games could be lost. I learned about corporate debt structures, about leveraged financing, about the specific vulnerabilities of a company that grows too fast, too arrogantly. My classmates were 22. I was 42. I had a focus they couldn't comprehend. Every equation I mastered, every case study I dissected felt like a bullet being placed carefully into a clip. When I returned, credentialed and fiercely knowledgeable, the pity in Jam's circle solidified. They saw my degree as a sad attempt to stay relevant, a hobby for a lonely divorce. James himself was patronizingly encouraging. "It's good you're keeping busy, darling," he said at a charity gala, his hand on my arm, his smile a masterpiece of condescension. I just smiled back. He was looking at my dress, my jewelry. He wasn't looking at my eyes. He didn't see the quiet calculator behind them. The trust fund became my war chest. I didn't live lavishly. I invested it while Jamis Company Astrocorp was taking on massive debt to acquire smaller competitors. I was making small, precise, strategic investments. I didn't go after Astrocorp directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I invested in its future. I bought significant silent stakes in the small, innovative tech firms that were developing the next generation supply chain software that Astrocorp would eventually need. I invested in a boutique logistics company that specialized in the exact niche market Astrocorp was trying to enter. I was building a moat around him without him ever seeing the bricks being laid in the financial world. A quiet reputation started to form about me. I wasn't a flashy hedge fund manager. I was a private investor with an uncanny nose for value and timing. My new name started to command respect in the right rooms. The rooms James didn't bother with because he thought he was already king of the castle. I was building a network of my own, a web of influence and information. I knew about AstraCorp's cash flow problems months before the market did. I knew which lenders were getting nervous, which major contract was on the verge of falling through. The crash, when it came, was slow, and then all at once it wasn't a scandal, it was a math problem. AstraCorp had over-leveraged itself. A key acquisition turned sour. A flagship project went wildly over budget. The debt payments became a crushing weight. Jamis' arrogance had blinded him to the fundamentals. He kept trying to dazzle his way out of it with press releases and bravado. But the numbers were relentless. The board grew nervous. The stock price began a steady, sickening decline. He needed a cash infusion, a white knight, but in that kind of market, white knights demand the kingdom. I watched it all unfold from my quiet study, my screens filled with data. He was probably too panicked to properly analyze. I waited. I let the pressure build until the whispers turned into shouts, and then I made my move. I didn't go to James the first, went to the board. I had my lawyer, Mr. Sterling, arrange a meeting. I laid out a proposal, a simple, clean, fully funded buyout of a controlling interest. The liquidity was immediate. The terms were firm. The money came from Vance Holdings, my company, the vessel for my grandmother's trust. The meeting with James was the final act. He was summoned to the boardroom thinking it was a last-ditch strategy session. He walked in, his face haggard, his expensive suit looking like a costume had worn too long. And then he saw me sitting at the head of the table. The shock on his face was almost physical. It wasn't just seeing me there, it was seeing the calm authority in my posture, the complete absence of the woman he thought he knew. He sputtered. He accused board of betrayal. He turned to me, his confusion turning to a cold, dawning horror. Where did you get this kind of capital? This is my company. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment, letting him feel the full weight of the reversal. Then I spoke, my voice quiet but clear, cutting through his blusters. From my grandmother, James Eleanor, the money comes from the trust she left me, the one with the specific condition that it never be used to bail out a man. I saw the words hit him, each one a tiny hammer blow. He remembered her. He remembered his condescending smiles. He remembered calling her feisty this entire time. He whispered, his arrogance finally completely shattered. You were just waiting. I was learning. I corrected him. And I was building. You were so busy building an empire you forgot to check the foundation. My grandmother taught me that the strongest foundations are built in silence. He was escorted out. The company was mine now. When I sit in the CEO's office in the chair he once thought was his throne, I don't feel triumphant. I feel a profound sense of responsibility. The painting of my grandmother hangs on the wall opposite my desk. Her cool, knowing eyes are on me. I run AstraCorp, not with the reckless hunger of James, but with the patient, strategic wisdom she embodied. I've paid down the debt. I've stabilized the company. I've empowered the smart, quiet people. He always ignored the legacy wasn't the money. The money was just the tool. The real legacy was the lesson, the patience, the quiet, unwavering belief in your own capacity. She didn't just give me a company, she gave me back myself. And every quarter that we post a profit built on sustainable growth, not on debt, an illusion I feel her presence. I honored her not by winning, but by proving that her kind of strength, the quiet, enduring kind, is the only kind that truly lasts for 25 years. I was the silent partner, the one who listened. You'd come home from the office still crackling with the day's energy, or heavy with its frustrations, and you'd talk over dinner late at night with a glass of scotch on weekend mornings. With the newspaper scattered between us, you talked about the board members and their petty squabbles about the road department that was leaking secrets about the manufacturing flaw in the new product line that you had to keep hushed up until a fix could be engineered. You talked about Alexei, your most trusted lieutenant, who had a gambling problem you were quietly covering for. You talked about the precarious loan from the Zurich Consortium, the one with the punishing variable interest rate that could sink the whole company if the market shifted even a little. You never saw me as a confidant. Not really. I was just a sounding board, a safe, soft place for you to organize your thoughts. You were the captain of the ship, and I was just part of the harbor you never imagined. I was actually studying the charts, learning the currents, mapping every hidden reef when you left. You were so terribly civilized about it. You gave me the house, a generous alimony. You told your lawyers, and they told mine, that you were keeping the company. It was your life's work. After all, I was to get cash assets. You were keeping the crown jewels, and you thought, I know you did, that you were being fair. You thought you'd left me with everything I could possibly want, and nothing you truly needed. It was in the crushing silence of that house after the lawyers were gone and the moving trucks had taken your things that I finally understood my real inheritance. It wasn't the money, it was the 25 years of conversation. It was the complete and total map of your empire's vulnerabilities I had stored without even trying. In my mind, I knew every crack in the foundation. I knew which pillars would bear weight and which would turn to dust under the slightest pressure. You didn't leave me with nothing. You left me with the combination to every single lock on every single door you owned, and I decided I wouldn't use it for revenge. Revenge is emotional, messy. It's a blunt instrument. I chose to use it as a strategic tool. It was simply an asset, the only asset I had that you had failed to account for. So I began to write it all down, not as a bitter wife's diary, but as a corporate audit, a due diligence report from the one person who had been in the room where it all happened. I reached out to the Alder Group. They were your biggest competitor, and their CEO, a ruthlessly elegant woman named Isabel Laurent, had been nipping at your heels for a decade. Getting a meeting with her was the first challenge. I didn't go through normal channels. I had her assistant's direct line from that time. You tried to poach her years ago. I used it. I told the assistant my name meant nothing to Ms. Laurent, but that I had a comprehensive analysis of sterling dynamics that would make the last 10 years of her competitive intelligence look like children's drawings. I said I would be in the cafe opposite her building for 1 hour. The next day she came. Of course she came. She sat down, skeptical, her eyes assessing me, not as a scorned woman, but as a potential liability. I didn't hand her a thick report. I simply opened a slim folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It listed 5 things: the exact amount and terms of the Zurich loan, the specific nature of the flaw in the new solar inverter, and the name of the junior engineer who had discovered it and been paid off to stay quiet, the details of Alexei's private bank account in the Cayman Islands where you funneled funds to cover his debts, the 3 key clients who were unhappy with the recent price hikes, but were locked into contracts for another 6 months, and the name of the board member who was secretly funneling information to a Chinese conglomerate. I watched her face. The skepticism didn't just vanish, it was replaced by a slow dawning awe. This wasn't guesswork, this wasn't espionage, this was insider knowledge of a purity she had never encountered. She looked from the paper to me, and I saw the recalculations happening behind her eyes. Who was this woman? I told her that single page was just the index, the full report was extensive. I proposed a deal. I would provide her with this intelligence. I would act as a secret consultant, guiding her strategy. In return, I wouldn't ask for a salary. I wanted an equity stake in the Alder Group, a significant one vested immediately upon the successful acquisition of Sterling Dynamics. She was quiet for a long time, then she said, "You're not doing this for money, are you?" And I told her the truth. I said, "I'm doing this for the equity I earned over 25 years of marriage and never received." She understood perfectly. We had a deal. What followed was a masterclass in corporate sabotage. And I was the ghost in the machine. I was the unseen hand. Isabel would propose a strategy, and I would refine it. Don't go after the clients yet, I'd say. Start with the loan, wait for the quarterly report. When the interest rate resets, then have your analysts publish a bearish forecast on Sterling's sector. Make the lenders nervous. Meanwhile, a little anonymous tip to the engineering standards board about the inverter flaw. Nothing major, just enough to trigger a quiet inquiry that would delay the new product launch. Then the most beautiful part: we didn't expose Alexei, we used him, Isabel's team, through a convoluted series of shell corporations that traced back to Alexei book he called in his debt. Suddenly he was desperate for a massive amount of cash, and who was his only source? I picture you in your office getting those calls, the nervous banker from Zurich, the worried head of road, your panicked right-hand man Alexei, asking for yet another advance. You were putting out fires everywhere, and you couldn't understand how they'd all ignited at once. It was a perfect storm, and you were at the center of it. Bewildered, the stock price began to slide, then it began to fall. The board grew restless. I knew they would. I knew which ones were loyal and which ones were only loyal to their stock options. The vultures were circling, and the strongest of them was Isabel Laurent, who made a lowball takeover offer that, in light of the company's sudden and inexplicable decline, started to look almost reasonable. The acquisition was swift. Once the momentum built, it was like pushing on a door that was already off its hinges. The board, fractious and scared, voted to accept the papers, called it a brilliant if brutal hostile takeover by the Alder Group. They wrote about Isabel's strategic genius. They never mentioned my name. I was perfectly happy with that. My name was on the share certificates. The day the deal was finalized, there was a small private signing ceremony at the Alder Group's headquarters. I attended as a major, albeit silent, stakeholder. You were there, of course, to hand over the keys to your kingdom. You looked hollowed out. You kept staring at Isabel, trying to understand how she had outmaneuvered you so completely. You shook her hand, a grim formal gesture, and then you saw me standing slightly behind her. I was just part of her retinue. You must have thought the ex-wife come to gloat. You came over to me, your voice a low, confused whisper. You said, "What are you doing here?" And I didn't say anything. I just smiled, a small, quiet smile, and Isabel, perfectly on cue, turned and said, "David, I don't believe you've been properly introduced to our new majority shareholder. This is the architect Of this entire transaction, her intellectual contribution was the cornerstone of the deal. The look on your face, I will treasure it forever. It wasn't just anger, it wasn't just betrayal, it was the slow, agonizing collapse of your entire understanding of the world. You looked from her to me, and I could see the pieces falling into place, the conversations, the casual secrets, the nothing you thought you'd left me with your eyes widened as you realized that the quiet woman who poured your scotch had been memorizing the blueprints of your empire. The knowledge you had poured into me thinking it was vanishing into a void had been compounding interest for 25 years, and now it had matured. You had not been defeated by a richer rival. You had been outsmarted by the person you considered a non-player. You thought knowledge was just talk. You never understood that it is the ultimate currency. It's weightless, invisible, and when wielded with precision, it is more powerful than any amount of cash. You can lose your money, your property, your company, but you can never ever take back what someone else has learned.